Hey, everybody. So, this is part two of Tina Friday. If you folks missed our live stream earlier today, Jordan and I sort of went over some breaking news in regards to the UN resolution on Gaza aid. The USA abstained from voting, which is something we haven't seen in a long time. But we did a live stream earlier today on that. So, if you missed it, please go check it out. Now it's time for some right-wing insanity reports. So it's Friday afternoon. Today is 12/22, right before the Christmas holiday. So one of the things that has perpetually been on my mind, and I think we've all seen this happen. We've had friends that maybe started off as Bernie Sanders supporters, got angry about the situation with the DNC, maybe was influenced by some other things. And as they start to, sort of transform from that, the next thing you know, they're sucked into this whole like red pilled pipeline. We've seen actual Bernie Sanders supporters that are now joined Patriot Front, which is like a neo-Nazi organization. So the question I always think through is, how is it that folks that would have supported what would have been the first Jewish American president can go from supporting that guy to, endorsing neo-Nazi ideology? Because that's quite the shift. There must be some reason for it. So I'm going to talk with soon Oliver Lee Bateman, who is a journalist that I worked with at Washington Babylon. He kind of got sucked into this. He had been writing for Mike Elk Payday Report, which was a publication that covers union things. I was covering the Democratic Party for Washington Babylon. He was covering labor issues. And, when that finished, he went on to co-host a podcast called Post Left with somebody who is now sort of endorsing neo-Nazi principles. He's obviously left that, not doing that anymore. And so he's going to talk about how all of that happens. But before we get into that interview, I wanted to talk about this article that came out this week. It's called Losing the Plot. Losing the Plot, which is a great title for this. Let me scroll up here. Losing the Plot, the Leftists Who Turn Right. This is written by Catherine Joyce and Jeff Charlotte. Jeff Charlotte, by the way, has done some great research on right-wing extremism. If you haven't seen his documentary on the family, which is on Christian nationalism, I highly recommend it. Very educational and informative. So let's turn to this for a second, just to so we can set the stage for what Oliver and I are going to be talking about. What do we make of former friends who fell down the rabbit hole of the right? All right. How to name the rude currents eroding the left, those which have claimed the hearts, minds, and substacks of so many former friends and fellow travelers. There are journalist provocateurs and the readers who have followed them rightward. The Trumpers come lately marching onto Glenn Greenwald's rumble or vanishing into Max Blumenthal's gray zone. There are those not quite there yet, such as Anna Kasparian from the Young Turks, currently mourning the leftism she now believes gaslit her about a crime wave it refuses to admit. I'm going through something very real and very sincere, she told a Disaffected Democrats podcast in July, and it's uncomfortable. It is indeed. Consider the dislocation that flickers across the face of journalist Matt Taibbi in a TV interview this summer for the conspiracist right-wing Epoch Times. For folks that don't know, the Epoch Times is not only very much a Trump supporting paper, but it's run by a Chinese cult, and it absolutely covers all kinds of crazy conspiracy theory. Acclaimed by the left during Occupy Wall Street as a scourge of corporate power, Taibbi is best known for his years at Rolling Stone. When the day eventually comes, the quote, vampire squid relentlessly jamming its blood funnel into anything that smells like money, end quote, Taibbi's unforgettable embodiment of Goldman Sachs in a 2010 article will haunt his obituary. While Taibbi insists his politics haven't changed, an oddly conservative way to insist one hasn't become conservative, his surroundings certainly have. Wearing a velvety brown jacket, jeans, and his default smirk, he sat for the Epoch Times interview amid the Libertarian Freedom Fest conference. This year, in addition to Taibbi, it featured as speakers presidential candidates RFK Jr., an independent who is also very much sucked into many conspiracy theories, including anti-vaccine ones, and Vivek Ramaswamy, a Republican who is actually far more extreme, in my opinion, than Trump is. Definitely on the side of fascism, along with former candidate Tulsi Gabbard, now a former Democrat too. I think you're all familiar with the turn that she has taken, a lot of it based on her anti-trans beliefs, united in their contempt for quote-unquote wokeness. Epoch Times, Jan Jaikilik, I think is pronounced, anointed Taibbi an American thought leader for Taibbi's critique of timid consensus-driven press that he says is reminiscent of the Soviet Union. As Taibbi charges that the media is unwilling to raise questions about things that have been decided, Jaikilik's eyes light up. It reminds him of his own experience bucking consensus, he says, when, as a university student, he realized that the core tenet of evolutionary science simply was not true. Gulp. In the midst of nodding along, Taibbi's normally expressive, still boyish face seems to freeze, his fingers to tense on his knee. It's a moment recognizable from countless movies. Imagine the record scratch, the freeze frame, the familiar Hollywood voiceover. You're probably wondering how I got here, which I think is a good way to describe this, right? I highly doubt that Matt believes that the core tenet of evolutionary science is false. So it's probably an uncomfortable moment when you find yourself on the stage with somebody that does believe that. I personally feel that oftentimes this is contrarianism for the sake of contrarianism, and it's easy to get sucked into that or being anti-establishment without having any real principle behind it. If you are falling into that sort of bucket, you're going to find yourself at some point in an untenable position. It's just by virtue of that. Taibbi's far from the first. Consider the case of David Horowitz, once a founding sponsor of this magazine. More recently, author of Blitz, Trump Will Smash the Left and Win. Or after him, Christopher Hitchens, one of my favorite actually, whose knowledge of Iraqi Baathism led him after 9/11 to align first with U.S. neoconservatives and ultimately with the very kind of religious nationalists he'd so long derided. We might mark 9/11 as a moment when many who believed they were for peace gave into the notion that it can only be won through war. Post-October 7th may prove another such moment. I think the reference there is obviously what we were discussing earlier today with Hamas and Israel. But the present left-to-right acceleration began in earnest with the onset of the Trump years in 2017. There are intellectuals in exile, the scholars whose once contained complaints about free speech or diversity initiatives metastasized into a broad contrarianism that found new patrons. There are the not so funny anymore. The comedians once known for their left politics, Chappelle, Roseanne, and Russell Brand, pulled rightward by jokes about trans people, pandemic, panics, and pedophiles. There's the new right, the new right's very own Kennedy, Robert F. Jr. of the bulging biceps. RFK Jr. may seem with his campaign push-ups little more than a joke to young leftists, but his history as a champion of intersectional environmentalism is long as the leader of activist organizations, a lawyer for poor communities of color, and a host for defunct progressive radio network Air America. But in recent years, he's been having second thoughts. We all know about Bobby and the vax, but did you know he recently learned we must seal the southern border to protect our food supply from a tsunami of defecating migrants shitting on our greens? You know, again, that's a trope of the right, the xenophobia encapsulated there. Hang on. These left-to-right sliders are at leftish to right, themselves migrants across the political divide, find themselves in strange constellation with those that they might have once disdained. Popped feminist icon Naomi Wolf now conferences with hard-right student organizer Charlie Kirk over the prospect of capital punishment for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. YouTuber Jimmy Dore, another once leftist comedian who lost hold of the joke, now marvels over his meeting of the minds with Tucker Carlson. We should do a show together. Call it the horseshoe hour. And I agree with this next little snippet here, except horseshoe theory, which imagines a political spectrum bending to meet at its extremes, doesn't describe this drift. It's one direction. So I agree with that. So mainly the horseshoe theory people are saying that here's the extreme right, here's the extreme left. It's a horseshoe because they meet at the top and they come together and congress over what is a common cause on these two extremes. But that's not what's happening here, because what's happening are these folks are no longer really leftists, and many of them are saying that they're not. They've slid down into this pipeline and they've become right-wingers. So it's early to dismiss many of these high-profile defectors as crackpots or spotlight seekers, as never truly serious in their political principles, or as plain grifters, because of course there is money to be made by saying, once I was blind, but now I see. It permits the Steve Bannons of the world to affirm their political faith, not as an argument, but just the truth. But in some ways, the peculiarities of the celebrity drifters are beside the point. The point is who they bring along. And I think that's also true. So this is a great article. I'm not going to read all of it. It's quite long, but it's also very well written, goes into many other aspects of it. Oliver Lee Bateman's at the end of the article, but we're going to have him with us here in a minute. So I believe Colin put this in the information. Let's leave it there. You guys can click on that, read the rest of it. In the meantime, part of the article looks at an area in New York called Dimes Square. Dimes Square has sort of been known as kind of a meeting of the minds, if you will, of folks that have gone from the post-left to the dissident right. So just to give you a clear idea of what that looks like, I grabbed some screenshots with one of these individual artists that is associated with Dimes Square. I want to put up the screenshots on the screen so you can see sort of the progression that happens. So this is the first one. This is Trump Sanders ticket for my birthday. So this, believe it or not, might sound crazy, but there was a time back right after the primary when Sanders lost where people were actually putting this idea forward as a good idea. The next one, I believe, yes, kill, blue pill, fuck, red pill, marry, black pill. So these are the various pills, like blue pill's the left, red pill's obviously the far right. Black pill, this is sort of accelerationist nihilism. So the next one. Whew. All right, so now we see the transition where she's actually saying, go fuck yourselves with Nazi symbols. Swastikas in there. And here you see the artist putting a brush up to her nose to mimic Hitler. I think the point here is that a lot of these folks say that they're using humor and irony and that it's just a big joke. Ha, ha, ha. I'm not serious. How do you not see, that this is funny kind of stuff? We've seen that a lot. And then this is like, I don't see how you make this into a joke. You're denying cultural Marxism. I'm not surprised. So the three parentheses, that's a designation for harassing Jewish folks. Wildly, I've also come to learn that this individual is half Jewish. So she has Jewish heritage on one side, but apparently congressing with Nazi ideas is perfectly acceptable in this world. Anyway, let's turn now to the interview with Oliver Lee Bateman and what he has to say about his experiences getting sucked in, his thoughts on why it's happening, and leaving that into that world. Today to discuss this issue about some are calling it the post-left going to the dissident right. I think it's sort of a pipeline being red-pilled into the alt-right, whatever you want to frame this as. But joining me is Oliver Lee Bateman, who is discussed in the article. He had a front row seat to what was going on because he was hosting a podcast with somebody that is being discussed in this article. We're going to get into that in a minute. But right off the top, Oliver, I wanted to ask you about sort of, how does this happen? Like, some people want to say that this is horseshoe theory. I don't think that that's the correct theory, because a horseshoe theory kind of has this idea that the right and the left kind of come together over some sort of common cause, and they have this common cause, and that's where they meet. I don't think that's correct. This is, to me, like more of a pipeline, because I think a lot of these individuals can no longer be defined as being on the left, really. They've just embraced all kinds of, far right belief system. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I think what happened with a lot of these folks, and I think it's important that it didn't make it into the article because I think it would be too detailed. But you know, Catherine Joyce, one of the co-authors, and I have talked for a long time, because the way I came into hosting that podcast was actually through, if I recall correctly, through a mutual acquaintance of ours, David Slavik, introduced me.
Oh, you're kidding? Wait, what?
He introduced me to someone. And then I wound up co-hosting What's Left, getting
Hang on, let's have a conversation about that. I did not know this. That is a fascinating tidbit of facts. So for folks that are unaware of who these individuals are, so David Slavik, I met David through Ken Silverstein.
Correct.
So Oliver and I both wrote for Washington Babylon. This was, 2014, 2015, much earlier on than the Trump presidency. But David Slavik was the producer for the Michael Brooks show. Many of you are familiar with Michael Brooks, very renowned media personality on the left. David Slavik was initially a producer of my District 34 podcast way back when we were first doing interviews and whatnot. So I did not know that David introduced you to. That's really interesting information.
Not directly. He introduced me to somebody who introduced me to somebody who.
Gotcha.
Like 2 or 3 iterations down the line.
Okay.
That's how I came to be on the show. But it shows how small the world is.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
That, somebody who knows somebody. So, and I had been working, with Ken and with Mike Elk at Payday Report before that. So like with Payday Report, I already had experience running a little operation and bringing in donations and building it up. And when I got the opportunity to do this podcast, it was going to be talking to people on the right and the left, which I consider a good thing even now.
100%.
I consider that to be a valuable thing. And I generally like a lot of people from that time period. I like to withhold judgment when I'm talking to somebody, at least when I'm talking to somebody or when I'm discussing a subject, let them talk and then we'll see what they say. And that's initially how that show began, sort of an open forum. And I think some people on the post left who began making that journey, I think that was part of it. But as I was saying, with regard to talking to one of the co-authors, Catherine Joyce, what I think, and they didn't have space to go into it, so I wanted to mention it here. And as a content creator and as a lifetime content person, actress, all these other things, that a lot of us follow the money, right? And at that time, it was hard to get podcasts off the ground on the left. It was overproduced, right? Like you had your Chapos and you had your other things that were making money. And an important piece, and there's a little bit of it in the article, but an important piece is that this opened up, and this happened in the 1960s and 70s with people starting to write for magazines like Commentary and stuff like that, going from the left to do that. Like Daniel Patrick Moynihan, the senator from New York, would move back and forth over his career, selling writing to the right and to the left and all those other things. But there is this incentive. The first thing that comes, I think, for most people is selling or getting a little money. And then the other thing is you start getting a little acceptance. That's number two. And then number three is you start getting pulled into, chat rooms or communities or Telegram groups or whatever, where everybody has kind of, you're talking to like the lifelong Republicans all day, or the based, or people who, have really out there reviews or views, or people who might be actually, they're just there to post, racist memes all day long. Like you have this and you see it for days and days and days. And there are people who can ignore that or be inoculated against it. But if you're making 20 or 30 grand a month off this world, and then you're talking to these people all day, you can't afford to diss them too much. And you eventually are going to start imitating aspects, or you're just going to start believing aspects of it because this is your community that you find yourself in. And that's kind of the missing piece. Like, and there have been multiple transition points where people from the new left move to the new right, and they have these conversion narratives or whatever. But usually it's just you lose acceptance on one side, or you were never quite there to begin with. And
well, that's part of it. Yeah.
You end up on this new side and they accept you, but initially you might have thought, well, abortion's not a big issue for me, or I'm okay with the birth control pill, or I'm okay with these sorts of things. But then suddenly 3 or 4 months in, you're posting on Twitter, like, heavy metal music opens satanic portals to hell, which you would have laughed at, in 2016. And you would have laughed at like the Chapo Trap House mocking that in 2016. But you're saying it. I think that to me is like super, super interesting. And
it is. The psychology is insane, right? How does that happen?
Yeah, I mean, it's money, acceptance. And then if you're in it long enough, it starts to become natural. It's any sort of conversion experience proceeds this way. But I think for the content creators who drive like all of this engagement and bring people with them, one of the craziest things for me, and I would talk about it with different people, Ken was one of them for a little while, like, was Bernie Sanders just sheepdogging voters into the Democratic Party? Was his goal, or AOC's goal, not his goal, but like his function, was he just going to create a new generation of Democrats? And a lot of the people that moved to the post left agreed with that. And they'd say, well, Bernie was just creating super Democrats. That was the whole point of the process. And then they're over there after months of content creation or years, and they're essentially sheepdogging people into the Republican Party.
Exactly.
You're doing one or the other. There's no mysterious third thing, Tina.
Right.
You're either a Democrat or a Republican in the United States. You're either for, these days, you're either all days, you're either for some of these baseline things like access to contraception, et cetera, or you believe we'd be better off without them.
Yeah, that's how extreme things have gotten. I don't disagree with that. What I find fascinating is that I think some of these individuals just started becoming contrarian for the sake of being contrarian, anti-establishment, without being moored to any set principle, which, if that's the case, you end up at some point supporting some very untenable positions. One of the points you made in this article that I thought was very salient was this concept that there's only so many times that you can see a meme that suggests there should be separate drinking fountains based on race before you start to actually believe, well, maybe there should be. So let's talk about that for a second. What I would call irony pilling. Some people will call it other things, but using comedy to sort of read people into extremist positions. This is a tactic that the alt-right started using early on in 4chan days. And I think it's still very much a part of that environment. How effective do you think it is?
It's incredibly effective. If you've ever argued with anybody, the ultimate, like argued like mom and dad or something, the ultimate move is, why are you so mad, bro? I'm just joking. I'm just shit posting. You always fall back on that.
Yeah.
And you can also believe it, but you always want to have that second position where you can fall back and say, no, I'm just shit posting. The internet is set up to make that work really, really well. And people that grew up where that's just native behavior, right? Like I grew up in the 90s, in chat rooms on an MIRC and stuff where that's just, I'd already gone through that phase, some kind of inoculated against it. But people from before that era, or people that maybe just grew up where the internet's just like Facebook and Instagram, they weren't ready for that level and it's easy to trigger them.
Right.
It's easy to get engagement off them. It's also easy to pull in fans and people to follow you who are coming up without an awareness of all that history. So it works really, really well. I mean, Brad Neely, the art critic who does like Patreon things, has done a report on that and called "Why the Left Can't Meme," where he basically argued that effective use of irony, it's hard to combat.
It is very hard. It is very hard because when somebody says it's just comedy, why are you upset? What is your response to that? I always say, well, it's not just comedy because people are being hurt by it. But now you're giving a very serious response to something that they're saying, well, now you're being serious again. So you end up in this cycle.
You can't win at the level of arguing on the internet about it. You can win in real life, or you can try to do things in real life about it, but you can't win internet arguments that way. Ultimately, whoever cares less wins the internet argument. And the ultimate, based, or it's not even based. I mean, a lot of dirtbag leftists still use this tactic, but a lot of them were kind of driven to the post left. That was another part of this. They were driven to the post left, or that's the other thing. That whole thing broke out over chat room wars where people were, self-outing or self-canceling each other, or, pushing each other out. And it's kind of funny because they were vying for limited attention on the dirtbag left, which is a pretty small contingent, just like the post left was a pretty even smaller contingent. So the people were fighting for space and attention there, and they get pushed out, and they've got to find this elsewhere. But it is a really great tactic for arguing on the internet.
Yeah.
The best. Who cares less wins.
Who cares? Yeah. And they're all trying to outwin each other on that. Part of it too, I think, has to do with the income inequality in the country. I think that there was a place in time in 2015. Obviously, this is the start of the Bernie Sanders movement. We have had ongoing income inequality in the country for a couple decades. It keeps getting worse and worse and worse, with no end in sight. The left is choosing, in my opinion, in 2015, with the choices they made within the DNC, to not give a left exit to that, to say, no, we want more neoliberalism. We want more privatization of public goods. We're not going to strengthen our unions, all of the things that sort of betray FDR politics, right? And I think that was a turning point where there was anger at what happened. And a lot of that anger was turned into these folks, as you're saying, Bernie's going to sheepdog people in the Democrats. I don't think that's actually accurate, but I understand where that anger is coming from, and it's very real, and that anger is valid. And instead of it having a healthy outlet, it didn't have that. And you could just see these folks getting more and more extreme in their opinions. And then next thing you know, they're like, Nazis aren't so bad. And you're like, are you kidding me? Like, what's happening here? Like,
it's totally understandable, Tina, because they, a lot of people for the first time in their lives gave attention or money or work to the Sanders campaign. They hadn't experienced a failed primary campaign in their lives yet. And so it seemed like he had a lot of potential, and they felt that things handicapped him winning then. And, there's a narrative in 2020 that, he was way handicapped there. And so they thought they couldn't win. If you do end up on the right, you can at least look to Trump over, putting the justices on the court that overturned Roe v. Wade, right? A major policy victory for the right.
Huge for the Christian nationalists. Yeah, 100%.
And you can just start saying, like, you can win these things. Like you might have to abandon, right? Like a lot of the post-left came over with a lot of that same, like, maybe we'll have sectoral bargaining. Maybe we'll have, renewed or, some kind of like renewed focus on unions, or maybe we'll have some new kind of, some of the people, like the article points out, where Oren Cass is a good example. We're sort of experts at creating left-sounding policies for Republicans,
right?
Like that was kind of their role. It still is their role. That unfortunately, a lot of that's just like work that doesn't get used, but they were creating a lot of that. But by the time you get deep into it, right, like, and you look at what, the base are sort of interested in, those issues have been moved, and they focused on, cultural issues, no matter what anybody says. And I was always one who was like, well, no, let's focus on the structures. Let's focus on material conditions, et cetera, et cetera. Right. But cultural issues are what people will talk about all day. They're what win elections. Unfortunately, they're what can win close elections. They're what get people talking about attack ads. It works on either side. Like, you ultimately have to run on nonstop. You don't have to, but like the structure of American politics is set up such that all we're going to do is talk about cultural issues all day, and income inequalities continue to get worse. And
which is true. I mean, the culture war is very real. Anybody that's in denial about that is not paying attention. A lot of what the article is calling the dissident right is very much focused on these issues, right? Whether it's anti-trans, homophobic issues, whether it's anti-union issues, all of these things seem to take center stage. And the income inequality is also getting back-ended by these folks. So really, even though they're using income inequality as a wedge issue to bring people over to the dissident right, they're not really doing anything to address it either.
No. In fact, their work will help ensure that the Democratic Party also doesn't address it, because everyone will be talking about cultural issues all the time. And I mean, you'll have the sort of DEI wars, where a victory is, Ron DeSantis and his team helped take over a 700-person state university in Florida, and which is a drop in the bucket, no matter how you look at it, whether you think that's good or bad. It's not as I argued in an article I wrote about it, like if you were some kind of true right winger and you wanted to revamp the universities, you try to shut them all down, but that's obviously not what he's doing. Right. But like something like DEI, you can just talk about it, and the Democratic Party can talk about it, and it creates all this discourse. Right. But none of it gets us any closer to thinking about, like, what should we do about a UBI once AI becomes a major thing impacting everything from doctors to lawyers to, low paid white collar workers. Like, none of that, that's all off the table.
It is off the table.
So.
Yeah.
Perfectly. No, it's perfect.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, everybody can rail about like whether IQ is a real thing or something like that. I mean, IQ is a great thing because like once AI really gets ramped up, right, it's not going to matter what your IQ is. That thing's going to do it. That godlike thing's going to do it a million times better than you.
Always.
Or at least the bosses will say it is, so they don't have to pay you.
You're not wrong on that. You're not wrong on that. So, I mean, that's sort of where it's at. I wanted to ask you specifically about how union organization became antithesis to this group, because initially I would say that wasn't the case, right? So the class reductionists, so to speak, I've always wanted to make this argument that, stop talking about identity politics and race and all of these other things, because at the end of the day, class is the only thing that matters. So if you're truly a class reductionist and you actually believe that, why would you be anti-union? It just doesn't make sense to me. But a lot of these folks became very much anti-union. That's part one. And part two is Trump was always, I think, anti-union, even though he was able to capture in 2016, he was able to capture a lot of the working class based on his populist rhetoric. It proved to be all untrue, right? He did not slow outsourcing of jobs whatsoever. That is, we have this, data now we can look at. When he was running, not so much. You had to go off of what his claims were. But now we have that data, and you still haven't been able to convince some of these Trump cultists that that's the case. They're still like, oh no, he's going to do more for my working class job than the left is. What are your thoughts on all of that? As someone that used to cover unions for Mike Elk, and B, having done a podcast with somebody that turned to union members and called them, or union bosses and called them labor pimps, I believe, or something of this nature.
Well, that's actually an interesting thing, because that comes out of the left there's a deep side of left communism that is stridently anti-union.
Really?
Anti-corporate union, and views them sort of as tools of the ideological state apparatus, and views them as things to be overcome, right? Like in a perfect world, you'd have the big union, maybe.
That sounds at the very least, crazy to me, but okay.
Those folks have come out, and I can say some of them know it very well. Like they came out knowing the left-com critique of unions extremely well. There's some validity to it, I'd say. It doesn't matter though. I grew up in a union household. You're always going to back the thing that has gotten you the 3% raise instead of the 2% raise, ultimately, if that's your experience. But if you've never been in a union, if you've never benefited from it, and this is part of the thing, declining unionization, right? Like lots of union workers voted for Reagan, and union rates cratered in 80 and 84, and he was unafraid to just fire air traffic controllers if need be. That sends a strong message. So if you grew up in that era or after, you probably didn't really, your understanding of union style issues was probably quite limited, particularly in how it impacted your family.
Yeah.
You might have seen them as an imaginary force for good, and then it's easy to transition to seeing them to being an imaginary force for bad. Right.
And
then there's a whole body of literature from the left that's ready to back up. And then when you move to the right, you can easily adapt that to do right-wing talking points. It's kind of interesting how it works that way. But some of them did come over, though. I will say some post-leftists did come over having read Oren Cass, or having read The Long Time. And I like him, and I've corresponded with him as a good person, outside of some of these folks who are goofballs. But Michael Lind, who has some place for unions in a lot of his analysis, you came over reading that and thinking that they could do something like that. But that's one of the first planks you jettison, because A, the unions aren't going to work with you. They're the Democratic Party apparatus. And B, you're going to get onto these other cultural issues, which are what drive engagement. That's what your shows are going to be about. That's what the things you're going to read are going to be about. That's what you're going to be talking about, whether it's talking about trad wives or alpha maxing or whatever, or, semen maxing or no fapping or whatever you're going to do.
Wait, I don't even want to know what semen maxing, and that's a new one on me.
Yeah. You should know all people, right? But the biz, those are going to be the topics that trend, and those will be the things that you'll talk about, either in jest, you could say it's ironic, or, at a certain point, these are what you're talking about all day, right? So it's really interesting to me. And it's kind of funny. There are these post-left fossils out there, the people that didn't make it, and they have a handful of followers on Twitter, and they're actually really nice people, and they're really well informed or intelligent, and they have no engagement with anyone. They're not writing for anyone anymore. They are the true leftovers, homeless, not on the left, not on the right.
Yeah.
They'll occasionally stand up for one of these figures that moved on long ago to this other side.
Right.
And they also kind of missed probably the whole like intra, like chat room, like marketing, like all of the like take refining that was going on, all of the everybody was, people were throwing people were appearing on each other's shows, people were workshopping each other's hot takes, people were even throwing work at each other, helping each other get work and different things, different fora, whether it's writing or whatnot, like going to each other's conference, like setting up conferences with each other this way. It was all happening this way. And a lot of these people that are just the leftovers missed out on all that. And they've kind of missed out on the last 2 or 3 years of the patch update that the post left is gone. So he didn't patch the software to let them know that that's gone. So they're just kind of there staying. Like, it is rare to find now maybe we'll find them again in 6 or 7 years, more of them, but it's rare to find like a class reductionist in the wild.
Right. Well, because it's an argument that ultimately doesn't hold up, right? Because to say that these other issues of race or identity don't matter whatsoever, that's an extreme position. And I think people on both the right and the left are going to at some point be like, for different reasons, obviously.
Yeah, it also hasn't held up. It hasn't held up because they have watched this not be reduced to class. They have watched it break again into these cultural issues.
It matters more. Yeah, exactly.
And so they're just kind of like a lonely voice in the wilderness. Like, the person who watches a sport and says like, well, it's all about this thing. Why don't they do more of this when the game has moved on? And there's all these other complexities to it. It's kind of
it is kind of funny in a weird way. I agree. Cause part of me is like, yes, class does in many ways have a undue influence in these things, but you're not going to find any neo-Nazis that are going to tell you that class matters more than race. It's just not going to happen, even though many of them buy into the same sort of, quote unquote, socialist principles about economics that the left does. It's a non-starter, right? At the same time, you have, liberals that are like, oh no, race always matters no matter what. And a lot of the, quote unquote, white liberals don't want to understand that no group is monolithic. And because no group is monolithic, there's different points of view that reside within each community. And, the idea that they're monolithic and agree with everything you think is totally wrong. So there's, multiple viewpoints at play here, but I do think it's dead on arrival. Let me ask you about Dime Square. Like, Dime Square is probably something that everybody in my audience is going, what is Dime Square? It's a place in New York City, obviously, but I think it became sort of known as not just a physical part of New York City, but a actual school of thought where people came to reside and discuss certain things that were basically post-left dissident right sort of discourse. Talk to me a little bit about Dime Square.
I mean, I've never been there. Like, I haven't been back to New York since 2019, and that, emerges afterwards. So I've never been there. I know some of the people associated with it, or did know some of the people associated with it. I think Catherine and Jeff, the authors of the piece, give as good a little introduction to it as you can. It's a shorthand for a little part of the art world. Anybody wanting to learn more about it should go and watch Brad Neely's excellent mini doc on Dime Square, and how, despite all the hype, it is an art scene, I think he calls it, that has produced more think pieces than actual art pieces. So more magazines have written about how everyone's meeting or hanging out there than it has actually done anything. It is amazing to me because
sort of a weird pop culture thing, I suppose.
Yeah, how just the investment of a few art festivals or a few art shows and a few plays by a very few number of people, a few, millionaires and billionaires, as they'd say, has generated this amount of conversation. But I think that, and we've seen this in previous like left to right shifts. Usually, I don't think political art personally, this is just me, but I don't think most, a movie like The Battle of Algiers is an exception. This is a phenomenal movie, but I don't think most political art is good. I think it's kind of crummy and kind of on the nose.
Right.
I think on average, though, the best, just by volume, by sheer numbers, the best filmmakers and the best are going to be on the left just because they are, so you're going to find the majority of that. You're also going to find the majority of the competition on the left.
That's true.
Once again, if you can get into this niche where you can go and, find some way to promote your art in a kind of Dime Square like setting or under that type of branding, you can get away with inferior work or less competitive work, right? Less competition. It really is. They used to always talk about the post-left would always talk about intellectual overproduction. And
right.
Like joke that they were going to go to the right because the intellectual production, while overproduced everywhere, is less overproduced there.
Right.
It's easier to find work there. And that's a fact of life. So you can get away with less, and maybe you've got to make it a little based, and maybe you've got to make it a little, you've got to put some things in there that you wouldn't have otherwise. But people seem to be able, no matter which side they're on, to figure out how to pander pretty quickly. It's those of us that don't, that we just kind of work and do what we can. But yeah, I mean, my analysis of a scene like that, right, is take what, you find this thing and it's not, why go, like let's say that there's like a brand new conservative fellowship being started that's going to be tied to, I don't know, Princeton. Yeah. Let's say Princeton has a think tank that's mostly conservatives. If you are a PhD in philosophy, right, coming out of like Notre Dame or somewhere, you're going to have like no jobs at all the conventional schools in the country. But if you can be a little bit based and you network with the right people, you might be able to get that gig at like the John Calhoun Institute of Princeton. Right. And like that will be your thing. And I have had these conversations with people doing this. So this is just straight up shop talk. Yeah. Like they'll be like, the left is dumb, the right is dumb, but I'll say this so that I can have my job to work on my thing. And I mean, that's life, but you are kind of contributing to something that might not be good long term, but that's the game. Everybody plays the game. A lot of my work talks about that. And so I'm interested in it, but it is pretty funny. That's exactly how it works. You're looking for less competition. Right. I mean, if you want, if you could act only in right-wing movies, as some people do, right? Like Kevin Sorbo. Kevin Sorbo is not hurting for work. Yeah. Kirk Cameron.
Yeah. He's like hanging out on QAnon shows at this point, which is kind of wild.
Yeah. You'll always have movies coming down the line to make and they're not going to be blockbusters.
Dean Cain.
Yeah. Dean Cain, he's gone a long way from Superman to that. Like, I mean, but I understand, like, and again, by now they're, if they weren't true believers before, maybe they always were. You work in that world long enough, as we say in the article, like, and you work in the world. Yeah. Yeah. That's just your social life. And like, but it is a little easier in some ways. And maybe the ceiling's a little lower, right? Like
I think it's lower.
You're never going to become the Taylor Swift of the right. Right. But you might become like, maybe
a big fish in a smaller pond.
Yeah. Like maybe you can be Oliver Anthony and you have that Richmond song, right? And it hits with the right. And maybe you work that, and that's kind of, he doesn't seem to want to, but maybe you work that and then you become the Taylor Swift of the right. And that's kind of which I guess would just be doing country music. That's just kind of your thing that you do. And I get it. But, as Jeff and Catherine point out, there are negative downstream effects.
There's a huge negative. Yeah, I agree. Huge. And we'll talk about those in a minute. You're hitting on something that I think is important for folks to understand, and that is what I'm going to call the grift, right? These folks that are heading up all of these movements are making money off of it. There is a lot of big money pouring into it from very wealthy individuals. Peter Thiel comes to mind. These are what I would call anarcho-capitalists, extreme libertarians that see actual financial benefits to giving money, small amount for them as small amounts of money. Yeah. For some of these individuals that are collecting it, it's not. So they get this money, they go and they do these podcasts, they, get these Twitter followings going, they create Telegram channels, or if you're Nick Fuentes, you create Cozy TV, which is, the live streaming service of all the white nationalists at this point. So but Peter Thiel, he might not agree necessarily with the white supremacist ideals that a lot of these folks do, but he sees a financial benefit of sort of seeding that sort of discord out there into American politics, right? So for him, that's the benefit. So it's not necessarily just about these folks. A lot of them, I think you're right. They start out knowing it's a grift. They don't necessarily agree with the politics of the people that they are creating content for, but there's still real damage that's going to be done from that. But let me ask you one question, because I feel like I need to have this word defined for folks. I know what you mean by based. Let's define the word based, because I think this is a word that's been used by the far right for a very long time. I would say initially, to make it simplistic terms, it's what the right wing uses as being woke in a sense, like to their principles. But let me ask you this. I do think there are people on the left that are trying to sort of reinstantiate this word at this point, redefine it as something other than that. What are your thoughts on the word based?
I think it is a word that maybe is a counterpart to woke, like you're either woke or you're based. You're also cringe or you're based.
Right.
It's kind of a know it when you see it sort of word like, oh, that's so based. You can use it ironically too, right? Like, so there's like some posters out there, some who are very popular, who kind of straddle the left-right line, like election legal, Pericles Abbasi has funny content, but like he might use the word based and it's just two muscular men having sex. And what does that mean, right? Like, what is the common, like that'll be the whole of the analysis. What does that mean? Right. So it's kind of playing with that word, and even within the base, they'll play with that word, but it's confusing.
Right.
Just, I think for just listeners that are just kind of like, I don't know what this, just know it as sort of the counterpart to woke, but right now there's no movement to end based, right? Because they would say it's because it's not institutionalized. There's a movement to end woke, right?
Yeah, there is a movement to end woke and very much so by some people that use the word based, right? So to me, this word is about the culture wars in a way that is probably not clear to a lot of the American public. It's a word I hear all the time, but I think a lot of Americans are like, what? Based? What is, you know what I mean?
Oh, yeah. I think woke might be well known enough across the mainstream, and Fox News has pushed it out. I don't think based is if you were to like poll Americans, I don't think that they would know.
But I would sort of laugh at the idea of Rachel Maddow coming out and like saying, is based our enemy?
Maybe she has. I haven't watched it, but that's kind of like a cheesy MSNBC story that they could do. Right. Kind of a cheesy counterpart sometimes in that way.
Like Tucker Carlson is like the war on the word woke.
He mentored her early in her career, so they both kind of do a version of that.
Exactly.
Even if he's no longer part of the mainstream media apparatus, but like that's exactly right. Like I could see that episode. I can see that whole episode in my head right now.
Yeah.
I wish that somebody would make that. I would watch it and kind of laugh at it because I'm sure it'd be terrible, but it would educate people on what based means. But I don't think it's, and maybe if we have more based successes, right? Like in institutions, I don't know if that'll happen. Then you'd have a movement to end based, but we're not there yet. We're part of a movement to end woke. But you did have a really good point with this question of the grift, and it's a job for the folks doing this stuff, and it pulls them into to these areas, right? Like they move into these areas and they work, and like it is what it is. That's it. That's the life of a content creator. YouTubers have it the toughest. That's got to be the hardest grind out there, where you're grinding, you need millions of viewers to reach scale and make money. You're constantly checking your audience metrics, and it's such a sad life. I mean, there's this great documentary on this creator Boogie, this heavyset guy that did video game reviews. He's also based, but like his fandom has decreased over the years, and his health has declined, and he's just generally in a bad way. And it's sort of all tied to the fact that all he could do was really create content.
Right. Well, let's look at a few of those folks. Obviously, this particular article talks about some of the biggies. Glenn Greenwald, obviously, he's discussed how he's gone from A to B. Glenn was absolutely a very well-respected journalist. I think some of that went by the wayside when he decided to go down this pipeline. I'll give you one example that's personal to myself. I had covered this WeSpa situation here in Los Angeles. I had been at 2 weekends of really violent protests in which, some of the things I witnessed was somebody getting stabbed, a Trump supporter stabbed a trans right activist. Another Proud Boy Trump supporter hit a journalist on the head with a lead pipe, who he actually faced charges for this. They haven't been able to figure out who the stabber was, but there was an insane amount of violence, Oliver. Like an insane amount of violence that I witnessed. And the only thing that Glenn wanted to talk about was the fact that some Trump supporter who was a female tried to get into the spa area and started arguing with some counter protesters, and the counter protesters shut her down and chased her away. So this became the story. This is what Tucker Carlson talked about. Meanwhile, I'm like, are you kidding me right now, Glenn? Somebody was stabbed, literally stabbed. Another person was hit on the head, a journalist. You should care about that. You are also a journalist. He didn't want to discuss any of that. The story became about, Antifa chasing away a Trump supporter. And how could anybody cancel, not have, free speech, this kind of shit. And so that's but one of many examples. I know you've seen a ton of them too. Like, how does this happen? I mean, I understand that for his audience, the grift is going to be based on, anything you can do to talk about Antifa is always going to get clicks. In that world, so I get that, but
I think that with him, that's definitely there's definitely been a lot of drift in that way, particularly in the domestic coverage that he does, because he's in that world. I mean, he had a falling out, I mean, it's pretty well publicized with Ken Silverstein, our mutual acquaintance. And
that's right.
I think that it's interesting with Glenn because he has the fairly consistent left politics that he's had where, opposed to the Ukraine stuff, opposed to the Israel stuff, that's all pretty consistent with him. And so that within the right, he's part of arguments about supporting these things or opposing them, right? So that's something that's very interesting about this. Like, some people came over to it and, it's just like lockstep, support for Israel, no support for Ukraine, and these kind of things. Ken's been pretty consistent, like no intervention whatsoever. But domestically, I think everybody that has cut their funding sources have changed. I mean, it's pretty transparent, right?
It's pretty obvious, yeah.
But then, you look. He would probably say you look at the left media, or you look at people covering on the left, and they want to place the emphasis on this, and he wants to place it on that. So, but again, that's the drawback of probably being funded that way.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, my thing is this. I think there is a space where somebody in the media can cover things from the right perspective or can cover them from the left perspective. I think that can be done. The danger is this, and the problem I have is this. When you start doing it without having a commitment to veracity, then it is really highly problematic. You are no longer, as far as I'm concerned, being a good journalist, right? You can't just flat out ignore things that happen because they don't fit a narrative that your audience wants to hear. That's dangerous. And I sort of feel like that's what is happening with a lot of the individuals that are named in this article. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, my personal belief is if you're primarily subsidized by Patreon or Substack or an audience, or independent millionaires or billionaires, left or right. Like if you're subsidized by any of these things primarily, you're going to make a lot of compromises in terms of your coverage, and you're going to sort of chase that audience engagement. And the more you get, like everybody does this to a degree, but the more you get, the less independent you can be. And so you're ultimately your job becomes guessing what the people want you to create in terms of content. Like you're just guessing, and that's a very hard life to have.
That is a hard life, and I think it's also very dangerous for society in a way, because now this is how we get to post-truth America, right? Where truth no longer is this objective thing that we can verify and is based on facts in the world, but it's whatever your opinion is that day, and everybody wants to hold their opinion as truth. Like that, to me, philosophically speaking, that is a very dangerous rabbit hole to go down. I mean,
social media and the Patreon, Substack style, and then independent funding of these things have made it such that truth is what wins out in the marketplace. Right? Like
you're not wrong.
This idea of marketplace of ideas is for this generation is so real. It's like right in front of them, right? Like, does this sell for $5? Am I getting revenue sharing from Twitter? I mean, I know some people that are like, at that point, you literally have to keep your stuff going in this kind of focused way. And there's going to be this push to up the ante every month, every week, every day, every tweet. Or you're not gonna draw it. The same goes to your Podstack or your Substack or your podcast or your journalism. And some people can balance it better than others, but I'll even catch reasonable people I know, like, because I cover this, so I'm real on my Substack, so I'm really interested in it, and it's sort of one way of inoculating yourself against it. But you can catch kind of like, oh, here's a pandering aside here from this person, or here these folks are doing, it's clear politics here, or you're following what your friends are saying on social media, and there's really not that level of engage. You know what I mean? Like you're not.
Yeah, no, I do know.
You're engaging with it as a content producer. You're not engaging with it as a thinker. You're certainly not engaging with it philosophically. And none of the stuff, none of the systems that we're working in are really set up to help us do that.
Right. No, it's a huge problem.
They're set up to help pull people away, whether they're people that were on a good path at one time, or just people that they're just kind of like they get pulled in directions and become unable to listen to each other, and eventually you're just selling to a limited market. Like your store doesn't need other people, right? Like you don't have to worry about 2 sets of water fountains,
which sort of just makes the echo chamber worse, doesn't it?
Yeah. I mean, it's the way we've created this society where everybody's a little marketing machine,
right?
Is
concerned with their brand. Yeah.
And all these brands fit into this political behavior, because humans are political animals at base.
Right.
I'm just amazed by the way this is. I mean, it's just amazing to see so many people having this stuff play out, right? Or these many feuds within it, because it's not just like if you study the right all the time and watch it as because I write about it a lot. Like I like to write about the feuds within it, so you'll see. Like, Candace Owens and Ben Shapiro have a feud over Israel, right? Or you'll see, Matt Taibbi have it out with somebody over the Twitter files, or he'll have it out with Elon over like something that fell out, like in their business arrangement or whatever. You'll watch this and you see all of this stuff play out. And again, there's this element on all sides involved in doing politics for sure. But it's amazing how marketing and sales and branding and all of these things that we're so aware of, we're hyper aware of it in 2023. We can't get away from it either. Right.
No, we can't get away with it. There's another personality mentioned in this article that somebody that I'm familiar with, Jackson Hinkle. I want to talk about him because I think he is really the poster child for what you're discussing here. This is a guy who was absolutely squarely on the left at one time. Then he just started getting, you could see on his Twitter, we used to be mutuals on Twitter, you could see him getting red pilled, so to speak, down this rabbit hole. And then it just became more blatantly in your face. And then he came up with this crazy thing called Maga communism. I'm sorry, that was never going to get off the ground.
Oh, yeah. I wonder what happened to that. That name is in it. That's where I know that from. And whatever, there were a couple of people that were involved in the production of Maga communism. Yeah. I wondered, maybe it still has a lot of viewers. I don't
I think it was always sort of a sideshow, and I'll tell you why. There's no way the Maga crowd or the Nazis are ever going to embrace anything with the word communism in it. It's never going to happen. I mean, you're talking about groups, whether it's the Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, whatever, go with your whatever right-wing group. They're all anti-communist. Being anti-communist is baked into who they are. So embracing anything that's even remotely communistic, not going to happen. Now, where this is appealing, this is where I think this is problematic. Follow me down this think path, is the National Socialists, right? The neo-Nazis. The National Socialists will embrace sort of communistic principles in nature. Now, again, they're anti-communist. The Nazis were anti-communist, but they do believe in a world in which some sort of economic socialism should exist for white people, for people of your nation, right? But it is very nationalistic. So you might capture some individuals, and I think Matthew Heimbach would be one of them. This is the guy that ran the Traditionalist Party, neo-Nazi party here in America. He's a avowed Nazi. He was showing up to these MAGA communist events right there with several others. So that is the only group you're really going to appeal to with this.
What became of all this? I'm glad you caught me up because I briefly heard about this. I know the left was covering it because it had sort of this obviously there's going to be a crossover thing because it was called MAGA communism. And I imagine that folks on the left were probably looking into it a lot.
Right.
I assumed it had either come and gone or run.
Yeah, I think that's true. It's come and gone and run its course. But I do think it's like a really great sort of exemplar of this sort of post left to right discussion.
Yeah, I mean, I guess good on him for trying to carve out some kind of weird little brand there. I mean, that is a sub brand, right? That somebody
it is a sub brand, but the guy ended up having, or I don't think he actually went through with doing it, but Nick Fuentes announced that he would be live streaming on Cozy TV. We've talked about Nick Fuentes on the show several times, as he's absolutely a white nationalist, very anti-Semitic, racist guy. So to have somebody like Jackson Hinkle, who at one time would yell at Nazis on Twitter, to now be like sort of joining forces with them. And, again, that's what this is about, right? The post left to right thing where, that's to me the greatest example. Let me ask you this. So Bernie Sanders, we talked to him at the beginning. Jackson was also obviously a Bernie Sanders supporter, as many were. We also have examples of, a Bernie Sanders supporter that became a member of Patriot Front. How do you go from like supporting who would have been the first Jewish candidate into supporting anti-Semitic neo-Nazi principles? I mean, that's obviously a thing. He's not the only example. Or you've seen these guys like at anti-vax rallies or Sandy Hook rallies wearing T-shirts that say Alex Jones was right. Cassandra Fairbanks, I think, would be another prime example of this.
I think out of like the Marianne Williamson left, right, there were a lot of people who were susceptible to, I don't want to call them conspiracy theories, but fringe ways of thinking and sort of fringe ideas.
I'd call them conspiracy theories.
And they sort of made their way. It can easily make your way, right? Like when one side peters out, you can easily be, if your group of friends or your group of associates moves to that direction, you could easily follow along with them. I mean, that certainly seems to be the case. That's an area I followed less than the actual like, money making and business side, because I've considered it so fringy and weird. But I think for it and what I've seen of it, I mean, yes, there's a few content creators in it that are maybe making a little money. Yeah. But I think that there's a social element, and they're definitely petering out, but there's this social element that would pull those folks over. I mean, I knew plenty, just personally and anecdotally, I knew plenty of people who were already kind of skeptical about vaccines and other things pre-pandemic, who were on what you would call like the left, or maybe they were like left libertarian burners or something like that. And it was easy for them to quickly make a position. Some of them some of them might be just, at the mild stage where RFK seems like an appealing candidate. Others might be all the way over to where, kind of like they might be in that Naomi Wolf stage where they're kind of moved over. So that's someone that's moved over to keep creating content. Yeah,
I agree.
Naomi Wolf has kept it going.
I'm waiting for her to come out and say the earth is flat at this point.
Yeah. That's with that type of person that all fits the brand, right? Like if that's, and I think it's still sincere in the mind. Like maybe after you've said this, like the next one is flat earth and maybe that becomes your thing. But you also, something about your mind also knows that you're doing marketing. Like as a content creator, those two things become inseparable, and it gets hard to avoid that, right? Like at what stage are you staying employed, and the other, what are you expressing your beliefs sincerely? It's tough to say when you are working in the marketplace. I mean, but for some of these folks that have these sort of like the Marianne Williamson left that I knew, it was an easy transition, I think, for those who moved over, or it would be if they wanted to move over, because there's so many similar things there for them to explore.
Right. And some of them, to be fair, don't move over. They end up being like, okay, this turned into a crazy train. I'm getting off the crazy train now. But so since you've looked at where the money is coming from and some of this stuff, who do you think are the more sort of scary individuals involved in that?
I mean, I think we know pretty well. I mean, it's pretty well established, right, that, a billionaire, like, it's a very small number of people. Like, it's like Peter Thiel, and it's small sums of money for them, like Peter Thiel, right? And Thiel has used this money very, very well. I mean, his goal ultimately is, sort of a stateless libertarian world.
Right.
I mean, he's got this seasteading, and he had
seasteading. Yep.
I actually, after Mother Jones did a piece on him, I did a piece on the Praxis Society that he had allegedly funded, and ended up getting a message from his publicist saying that, well, technically he didn't fund it in his personal capacity. So then I talked to the author of the Mother Jones piece. And, that is kind of like that. I mean, that's a great level of plausible deniability. Obviously, you're a billionaire, so you've got multiple ways of moving
funding things. Yeah, moving it around. I mean, this is a guy that took out Gawker because he didn't like what Gawker said about him. That's a really
strategic move. Yeah, it's a guy that understands that kind of strategy. I think he has given interviews where he's upset with the cultural stuff. He's upset with the cultural stuff in the Republican Party. I think he's upset that some of these backed figures have probably just turned into conservative Republicans. But you can also see that, like, some of the based figures that have come up, they might have pushed a lot of based or traditional material. Then they'll write a big piece, like, after they come out under their own name or something. And it's kind of like basic libertarianism.
Yeah.
They'll do like some value stuff at the beginning and then libertarianism.
Right.
Like, I think that movement, just like with Reagan, right? Lots of family values, lots of other things, nothing for families.
Nothing for families, or nothing to correct income inequality. In fact, let's make it worse.
No, I mean, that will win. I mean, that has never changed. Even if people like Orrin Cass have said, "Oh, we want to make the Republican Party less about the party of tax decreases." Well, no, Trump did a tax cut.
Yep.
I mean, he can argue it was successful. Yeah, and for corporations, and he can argue that it was successful.
Yep.
We help hire people or whatever. But the essence of what that party wants to achieve is tax cutting. All this other stuff is window dressing. It just happens to make people very animated and fight and impact each other's lives. And
that's right.
In some states we're seeing restrictions. Texas has had some particularly rough stories on reproductive freedom.
Yeah.
And those are tough. Like, so those are real things that manifest themselves out of all this, and they're bad.
They're bad. I agree. So it's a combination, I think, the push and pull is a combination of guys like the wealthy elites like Peter Thiel that are benefiting financially from funding this stuff. Even though he's gay, he doesn't seem to care that some of the candidates he supported are very anti-gay rights.
He said he cares. He's kind of irritated. But
irritated isn't going to change. I think
at a certain level, your desire for low taxes is much greater than your desire for, because if you're rich enough, they just let you do it.
Yeah, exactly.
You can just do it.
Which is just cringe, right? So, but that's definitely a thing. And I would say part of the conversation too is the Christian nationalists that are in absolutely 100% gaining power in all of the power struggles as well. They've been able, obviously, overturning Roe v. Wade has been something tantamount for them to do for decades now, and they finally got that win through, the culture wars, I would say. And these folks are very committed to their positions, and those positions matter more to them than income inequality does, for sure. I think they're going to try to overturn gay marriage next. But this is to me, this is like strange bedfellows. These are a lot of groups that are basically saying the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And I'm sitting here going, yeah, no, the enemy of your enemy is not necessarily your friend. This is dangerous. And I'd also say wildly that many of these individuals also seem to tout this idea that cancel culture is wrong, that First Amendment rights are paramount or tantamount, that free speech is tantamount. But they're also the first to try to censor people that they disagree with, in much in the same way that they'll all hold up Gadsden flags and say, "Don't tread on me," while they take away the rights of others. So there's definitely a part of the psyche involved in the dissident right that doesn't quite seem to grasp that they are on a slippery slope.
I mean, in following them closely, it's been interesting to see that there are people who will and have admirably stuck to positions on just no cancel culture. Like this, trying to get rid of this university president is also dumb.
Yeah.
Right. There are some that say that, and they either have positions where it's good for them to say that, or they can afford to say that. Somebody like me, I argued, plagiarism is a terrible reason to get rid of anybody, right? Like just getting somebody on a technicality, who cares? I wouldn't get students on a technicality when I taught on something like that. But
discipline the actions, but don't necessarily. Yeah, I got you.
Yeah, or at least know what they're dealing. What you're dealing with, but it's not enough to give somebody the boot. But there are the majority, and some of them are pretty transparent about it. They'll say, "Well, we just want to win."
No, that's exactly right. We just want to win. They don't care who gets thrown under the bus as long as they win. You are correct on this. I've heard them say it too, you know?
So like cancel culture worked for us on the up. And when it doesn't work for us, we hit them with their own medicine. And that's the nature of politics. But it is the nature of politics. So they're not wrong there. You want to win.
But meanwhile, our constitutional rights get chipped away at. Meanwhile, income inequality is getting worse, not better. Meanwhile, so is this, this, as far as I'm concerned, this is an erosion to all the things that they themselves say they stand for. And I just, to use the word irony, the irony here is like shocking to me.
Yeah, I mean, the promise that seemed to be there for a lot of people, I was not ever optimistic. I mean, just being a historian, I was never really optimistic about anything.
Yeah.
But like the promise that seemed to be there in 2015 for a lot of people is long gone.
Right.
I mean, there's not any splinter movement within the left or splinter movement within the right that's going to address these issues.
No. So
it's just going to be cultural battles going into 2024.
That's how it feels like.
A lot of stuff's going to play out through the various courts, and that's it. And that's what we have to look forward to. So instead of solutions that were being talked about in 2015 and 2016, this is what we got, like the worst of all possible worlds.
Outcomes,
and then, we have a lot of disenchanted people as a result. And we have a lot of unmotivated leftists who probably aren't, like if the polls are to be believed, super excited to vote for an 80-year-old president.
There's that.
They're
the fact that we have like Trump and Biden as our front runners is just a sad statement on where we are at, because obviously this is not the best America has to offer.
Certainly not the youngest.
No, right. Let me ask you this, Oliver. What is the solution here? Is there a solution? I mean, so a lot of these individuals, I think, are just kind of sort of in a cult in a way, right? They're worshiping at the cult of being an ANCAP, of being, who knows, whatever group you're in, Trump support or whatnot. Is there a solution here? Is there a way to pull folks away from that and kind of shake it up?
I am curious to see what will happen if and when the Republican Party can sort of disengage from the Trump orbit, which, I think it's very much tied to his personality and his lifetime as well.
Right.
And what will happen, because they'll settle back into being the same two sort of establishment parties that they are. And will there be the possibility for another Bernie insurgency? Will there be the possibility for something else 10 years down the line, or 12 years down the line? What will that look like?
Right.
Or just the other thing that I keep thinking about, and I don't know, will AI-driven job loss, which is going to pick up in 24, 25, going to force reckoning with some of the questions that Bernie raised?
Right.
My hope is that it will.
I think so eventually.
My fear is that the Peter Thiels of the world will just say, nobody, just like unemploy them and don't give them anything.
Yeah, let's just go to outer space, right?
Yeah, which is truly the worst of all possible worlds. But so I think that the accelerationist on the left or the right would say, let's see what happens with that. Yeah. And that is kind of like, I'm kind of holding out hope for, my hope is that something would be done that would give people healthcare or some kind of basic income based on that kind of dislocation. Like the country can't afford that kind of dislocation.
They can't afford it. I mean, that's exactly it, Oliver. I think what's contributing to this thing that we're discussing, also contributing to an unstabilized democracy, quote unquote, and using my scare quotes, is the income inequality, is the fact that people can't make ends meet. I think if this one thing was addressed, it would help to cure so many other things that are going on. But the wealthy elites, the plutonium in this country, they want to keep extracting wealth. That's all they actually care about. So it's problematic for that reason. Yeah, I
mean, if we add the middle class to the poor, will they have to make a settlement? Do they care enough? My hope, my heart says, you got to do something, right? Like at that point, you'll have everybody or a lot of people implicated, or and my head tells me the goal is to do nothing for nobody, right? Just this endless lip service and
That's sort of what it feels like. I had asked Tom Steyer, who was obviously a billionaire, when he was running for president, I asked him this question. I posed this question to him. And his response was that you're going to have to force the wealthy elites to change. They're never going to get there on their own, no matter how bad it gets. And that was a very sobering thing for me to hear, because in my mind, if you're like a Peter Thiel, eventually, if you have nobody left to sell widgets to, you do something to change the course of that because it's only logical, right? Well, apparently, no, that's not right. Apparently, once you've stockpiled so much money and you don't really need to sell anything to make more money because you're that wealthy, it doesn't matter anymore. And I think that's sort of where we are at with these individuals. And so you're right, they're tuned out. They don't care if everybody, stabs each other at protests, whatever. To them, it's like, whatever, let them kill each other.
That's a great question and a great answer from a rich man who knows the deal. And he's right. Like, the question will be, will this get bad enough? Because neither of the people involved in this election are even trying to answer this question right now about income inequality and the future of income inequality, which is even greater than the present.
Right.
Like, this should be front and center in the debate. This is what I think about all the time. And it's kind of funny because all these content creators we've talked about, right? Like all these podcasts and all these other things. One of the first thoughts, like in somebody that works with ChatGPT every day, has watched it improve, uses it in their day job. I am amazed, like, with the right deepfakes, you could just deepfake and do the entire Red Scare podcast.
Yeah,
you could
no kidding.
Deepfake meme poster. You could take Drill. People already have with bots. Like, take Drill and just run him through AI, and people will get that. You could take all of the top posters and replace them. You could take probably all of the top YouTubers once the tech gets there and replace them. So all these people we talked about could be made irrelevant. And, if you're Peter Thiel, why not just employ AIs to start doing this?
Of course. Yeah,
AI
absolutely.
Bronze Age pervert. You don't need all of this other stuff. And it's so interesting to me. And I think we're going to get to that future where that's actually going to be a question. I've thought about, just as an experiment, like creating an AI avatar that's like a based MAGA tradwife or something, and having it write books on like the Trump and the Book of Revelations or something, where this is Trump playing 4D chess, losing and being reborn, and just running this to see doing
what comes
the fake video, doing the voice, doing the whole thing, just to see can I get an audience with this? Can I get it in the right chat rooms? Because with AI, you can create something that's going to constantly, you can have photographs, you can have video, you can have all this stuff, and just see how many of these can I run? I've talked about this with other people too. So as a content man, I've thought about that. Yeah. And but then I'm like, man, I'd have to actually read these words and think about this. And so this crap is so bad, I can't even imagine writing it, much less somebody reading it.
Yeah.
But
no, it's scary.
I hope, Tina, that I hope it turns out to where they have to come to some kind of social settlement about looming inequality.
Yeah.
But we'll probably have to be forced to that. And as for all this, it's just a bunch of people, poking the bear as we go along. Like they're contributing to all of this. This is a crappy time in the history of the Republic.
It's crappy. I agree. It is a crappy time in the history of the Republic. Fascism is on the rise, and these folks seem to be okay with that if they can, skim some money off the top on their way back. Oliver, where can people follow you, read your work, pay attention to what you're writing on after this this episode?
You can follow me on Twitter at Mustache Club US. You can go to my personal website, oliverbateman.com, or you can go to my Substack, oliverbatemandoesthework.substack.com, where actually most of the writing on that Substack is stuff that we talked about today. So
I was reading through some of it. You've been doing, I didn't know until I read this in this Times article that you've been working on this area. It's very fascinating stuff. I obviously have an interest in it because I do cover right-wing extremism. And I've been noticing this thing happening, and it's just like, wow, this is like a thing. How do you go from supporting a Jewish candidate to being a neo-Nazi? How is this logical? But here we are. Kind of a thing.
As our discussion shows, there's a path.
There's a path, 100% there's a path. Oliver, thank you so much for joining us today to discuss this very informative stuff.
Great conversation, Tina. Thank you.